come in. Hello, LSHTM. Great to see the folks in London and all of you on the call. I'm Will Masters. I get to direct the Tufts University component of the A&H Science Policy Platform, and especially have been able to um, really welcome this new book from Jocelyn and Prabhu that will launch our research community on food supply loss and waste. These research communities are managed by Nola Jenkins, and our overall work is managed by the project as a whole is managed by Alex Knuppel. So they'll lead the session. I just wanted to say, really a huge thanks to Jocelyn and Prabhu for this work, which I think you'll find fascinating to be a reframing of this core question in what I hope will be a very vibrant research community around food supply loss and waste. So Nola, what's in store for us?
Thank you so much for that. I will actually let Alex start with a little background to the research communities, and then I will introduce everyone to this new community, the food supply loss and waste community, before handing it back over to Jocelyn and Prabhu to talk about their new book.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks, Nola. And thanks, Jocelyn Prabhu. I'm really excited to hear this talk today. And thanks, Will, for the introduction. So we've got so many people on this call, which is great to see. I'll invite you right away to just say hello in the chat. You can just say your name, what country you're calling from, what organization you're affiliated with. I love seeing in these calls all the different places and things that people are working on. It's one of the great parts about this program. So for those of you who are new to research communities, I'll briefly share some background about the program, which I've been lucky enough to work on with Nola and Will here at A&H Academy. So to zoom out, the A&H Academy is a network of 13,000 people working across over 130 countries on all aspects of agriculture and food systems for nutrition and health. There are A&H Academy members doing cutting edge research in academic spaces, for governments, civil society, and many other types of organizations. And we created research communities to give these A&H Academy members a space to share their research with each other and to learn from each other. And we've hosted almost 30 events like this one since the program started in 2024, and have had hundreds of people join and share their research on these calls. This is our first community was focused on demand for healthy diets and food access. And in those calls, researchers have shared their work about the cost of a healthy diet, consumer demand and choices for healthy foods, food safety, and many more topics across many countries, including Ghana, Nigeria, Pakistan, Uganda, Vietnam, and more. Now that we've, had plenty of time to form a community around those topics, we thought it was time to create a new community focused on food supply, loss, and waste to allow this program to cover all aspects of the food system and truly convene, all the researchers in our network who are doing, amazing things in the research space. For both of these communities, we host events like this one called Research Roundtables, where members can share their research and have conversations about what they found to be successful, their shortcomings, their learnings, and their goals. We want to emphasize that in these communities, anyone can present. And we encourage people to use these sessions to share new findings or emerging research that's not yet complete. And we really believe in the power of having like a diverse group. And I think as you'll see, so far in the chat, if more people share where they're from, I know just looking around the room, there's lots of people from diverse places in their career and countries. And we believe just having that many perspectives can help researchers and participants learn. So we'll follow up with more details at the end of the call if you want to share in the future, but there's very few requirements to present and share your work. We simply ask that you have a clear goal and offer a little bit about the topic and save time for conversation too. So that's a bit about our history and the mission of our program here. And I'll turn it over to Nola to share a bit more about today's discussion and the food supply loss and waste community overall.
I'll keep it really brief because I know that the main event today is Prabhu and Jocelyn, and I know you're all eager to hear from them. But just a little bit more about the food supply loss and waste community. It's really our goal, kind of to reiterate what Alex said, that people can join these conversations and share perspectives between anyone who may not otherwise have the chance to meet. And maybe some of you have worked together in other parts of your career, and this is an opportunity to get feedback and share different perspectives on similar research or different research, but on the same topic. So this community, the goal is to convene researchers, policymakers, implementers, anyone kind of working in this space on topics related to the food value chain. So that might be things related to production, it might be related to loss along the supply chain or post-consumer waste, or it may have something to do with interrelated issues. So something like food safety, which has also featured in the food access community, and there's overlap between the two of them. So you're more than welcome to join both of these communities. And if you want to present in any of them moving forward, you can sort of choose which one feels most appropriate for your specific goal of your research to present there. Other topics that we may have in the future might have to do with things like the pros and cons of plastic use in food preparation and how that may affect loss and waste throughout the system as well. So if you would like to present at an upcoming event or write a blog or share anything else with us, I've put our email in the chat and I'll share it again throughout the session, but it's researchcommunities@tufts.edu. And so now I will pass it over to Jocelyn and Prabhu. And thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you, Will, Nola, Alex, for inviting us to make this presentation of our new book. And we really look forward to the conversation around that today. Just to start, I'm going to make some stage setting comments with a few slides, early slides, and then the real presentation will be done by Jocelyn, who's the expert on food loss and waste from our side. The book was out 2 days ago. The ebook is out, and you can see the link to the ebook in the chat. And it's free, so you have no excuse not to download it and to read it. Okay. So let me start with just a few words about the Tata Cornell Institute. The Tata Cornell Institute is an institute focused on food, agriculture, and nutrition. And we are based in the College of Agriculture at Cornell University. And it's a long-term research program that's endowed with a $25 million gift that was given to us by Mr. Ratan Tata, the late Mr. Ratan Tata. And the focus of our program has been on research and promotion of healthy and sustainable food systems and food systems transformation. So as we've been working in this broad area of food systems transformation, food loss and waste comes out as one of the areas that need attention, that's had very little attention as we think about food systems transformation. And that motivated our work. And it started with Jocelyn doing her PhD thesis in this area. She spent a year in southern India tracking tomato value chains and looking at food loss and waste, going all the way from the farm to the consumer plate, looking at quantity loss, quality loss, nutrient loss, etc. That work came out in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. But as this work was going on, we also realized that there's some bigger, broader issues around consistency of definitions of food loss and waste, competing frameworks, competing pathways, methodologies that don't talk to each other, and extremely poor data conditions. And that motivated us to pull together a global assessment. And that's what we're presenting today. Next slide, please, Jocelyn. So some of you who are my age, and I think Will is the only one in the room that I can see in my age category. Remember that in the 1970s, during the global food crisis, American children were told around their dinner table not to waste food because they were children starving in Asia and Africa. So that was one of the early sort of narratives and civil society actions around food loss and waste. And this subject has been in vogue since then. However, the academic work around this has been very limited. And it's only more recently that you see solid academic work coming in. The food price crisis of 2007 and 8 brought food loss and waste back onto the agenda again. And that's when FAO came up with the 1/3 of all food is lost number. And so we took a look at this number in the book and said, where did this number come from? How was it measured? What's the actual number, etc.? And Jocelyn will talk a little bit about that. and that kind of brought a lot of attention to the supply side. How do you improve, reduce production losses, post-harvest losses, etc.? And then the Sustainable Development Goals brought food loss and waste into a broader picture by positioning it as within the context of responsible consumption. And once you bring it into responsible consumption, then the stakeholders and communities interested in food loss and waste expands way beyond the agriculture community, the food community, and it brought in the environmental community in a big way and the climate change community in a big way. So now we've got a wide group of actors that are interested in and that are working on food loss and waste. And that's where I think the big challenge is. And the challenge is to understand these multiple frameworks, multiple pathways, and to figure out common approaches to tackling them. Next slide. The other really important issue that comes up as we think about food loss and waste is the type of loss and waste and the extent of loss and waste really depends on where a particular country is in overall economic development and overall structural transformation and food systems transformation. So as economies have been developing, as urbanization has been increasing, as incomes have been increasing and diets have been changing, we've seen that and especially as the need to feed urban populations has been rising, we see that there's been tremendous changes in the way food is supplied, tremendous changes in the food value chains becoming increasingly complex and long food value chains. And with that, the losses along these value chains rising quite dramatically. But the other issue that comes up with food system transformation is that it's no longer an issue of loss of staples. It's an increasingly big issue around the loss of perishable foods, because that's where the diets are moving. Diets are moving towards more nutritious foods, which tend to be more perishable foods. And as that demand has been rising, we see this locus of loss going from quantity loss to quality loss and nutrient loss and safety issues coming in. And that happens across the value chain. We also see the movement from loss along the value chain to waste at the consumer level as you go through the process of economic development. And in the book, we try to work through some of these issues. Next, please. And so what does this book offer? What's wasted potential? I think when we framed the issue around wasted potential, we were thinking very much about the wasted potential of being able to feed a growing population, being able to meet the demand of rising demand for food diversity, food quality, etc. And that the more we can tackle food loss and waste, the more we're able to meet that rising demand for food in terms of quality and quantity. But the second is, because we are working with so many different stakeholders and actors in this area, and many of these actors are working in silos, there is wasted potential in terms of action. And the more one can create a cohesive, comprehensive assessment around food loss and waste and come to some cohesion around definitions and methodologies, etc., the more one can be more successful in tackling food loss and waste. And that's what the book argues for. It argues for creating convergence across all these frameworks, across all these definitions and methodologies, and harmonize across them, and then to identify viable pathways for creating impact around long-term reduction in loss and waste. And to do this with strong evidence-based approaches and with very strong database that we can use. And with that, I'm going to hand over to the real expert on this from our side, that's Jocelyn. Jocelyn, take over.
Wonderful. Thanks, Prabhu. So when we started this work, and this is really, even when I started as a doctoral student, one of the first challenges is that there's no agreement on what even is food loss and waste, and because there's no consistent definition. So what's become a stylized figure of 1/3 of food produced for human consumption is lost or wasted globally. We ask ourselves, what actually goes into this number? And we look at the fraction in simplest terms. And so we have to think of what's the numerator and what's the denominator. So we're looking at food that is produced for human consumption. And this is the 2011 figure that came out from FAO. And so of the food that's produced for human consumption, 1.3 billion tons was estimated to be lost or wasted across the value chain. And so we think about further, what exactly does this lost or wasted cover? And we can look a bit more detail about, this figure comes from agriculture production all the way through household consumption. So these are the value chain stages that are covered by these two figures. What's excluded from the calculation are inedible parts. And this is really a feature of food produced for human consumption. Inedible parts, by definition, are not part of human consumption. And so it's really focused on this denominator is on the edible parts of food. Then we ask ourselves, well, what destinations count as food loss and waste? And in this framework used, any food that was produced for human consumption that went to animal feed, seed, industrial use, or food loss and waste management, so we can think of landfills or other non-food uses, that counts towards this figure here of food lost or wasted. So that's one framework. And when I started my PhD, that was kind of the way of thinking for a bit from this big report. But then the SDGs came up with their own indicators. So there's two indicators: the food loss index, that where FAO is the custodian agency, and then the food waste index, where UNEP is the custodian agency. So these two indices look at different parts of the value chain. So the food loss index covers the on-farm post-harvest stage through processing and packaging, so up to but not including retail. And then the food waste index captured the retail through consumption stages. So already we can start seeing that there are differences between what the SDG indicators capture and what food loss and waste meant for the 2011 report. What counts towards food loss and waste? So these indices include inedible parts. So both the edible and the inedible part count towards that numerator and denominator. And the food loss and waste part is really only when food is moved to food loss and waste management. So what's not counted as food loss and waste is the feed, seed, and industrial use, because these are viewed as productive uses. So if you have food that either edible or inedible parts in these value chain stages and they go towards animal feed, that's not counted towards food loss and waste. And so what we see is that we're using the same or similar terms, food loss, food waste, food loss and waste, but we're not really talking about the same thing. The other issue is that even between these two indices, they're not comparable. So the food loss index is a percentage of production lost compared to a baseline year, again, covering these value chain stages. The food waste index, though, is a per capita mass of food waste compared to the baseline year. So it's looking at the food that arrives at the retail stage through consumption, but in terms of a per capita mass. So these two indices can't be compared or aggregated across the value chain because they have different methodologies and also data requirements. So the food loss index is meant to align with the FAO food balance sheets framework. And so it looks at different food groups, different food commodities, whereas the food waste index is looking at just total fresh mass. So it's not, we can't look at specific commodities at these stages. And there are issues with the scarcity of primary data, which leads to this over-reliance of modeling. So the food loss index uses modeling, supplementing the food balance sheets data with data from the FAO food loss and waste database. But only about 7% of the data from the food balance sheets for the loss data is actually officially reported. So that's the primary data that exists. And we'll look a bit closer at what the primary data is for food loss and waste database. For the food waste index, UNEP specifically requires using primary data for tracking progress on this indicator, but because there's lack of primary data, they haven't officially reported a global food waste index yet. So this current data challenge, we view it as an opportunity. So I mentioned the FAO food loss and waste database. So this was an exercise where FAO used machine learning to kind of pull together all of the data that exists from different reports and papers and databases. And so we looked at over 21,000 data points to understand from 2004 to 2021 and to understand where this data is actually coming from. And so what we see is that, so each box represents one data source. And what we see is that the majority, like over 50%, so almost 65% come from the African post-harvest loss information system. So this is a database that focuses on loss of staples in sub-Saharan Africa. So already there's this kind of heavy weight on a specific geography for specific food group. And not only that, but we can imagine that all of these different squares, all of these different sources might be using a different definition of what food loss and waste is. So how do we even kind of wrap our head around aggregating this type of data? The other issue is that, again, how much of it is actually primary data? And the answer is not much. So when we look again at the food loss and waste database, the data collection method, the vast majority is modeled estimates. And so when we think about the food loss index, that's using the food balance sheets data where not much of it is primary data, and then supplementing that with data from the food loss and waste database, which again is a lot of modeled data. We have to ask ourselves, where is the primary data? And so we view this as an opportunity to really come together to have a consistent food loss and waste data framework so that can inform, as we call for more primary data collection, we can have a cohesive approach across both the private and public sectors so we can better align these data collection efforts. And so the way we approach that in this book is to align food loss and waste frameworks that enable inclusion of stakeholder perspectives. So Prabhu mentioned that, especially when the SDGs came out, now food loss and waste had this kind of broader stakeholder group. So it's not just agriculture and nutritionists, it's really, environmental and, we can include food scientists. A lot of different stakeholders have an idea of what food loss and waste means. And so The definition we use in our book is adapted from an FAO 2014 report where they were aiming to arrive at a globally applicable framework. And so we define food loss and waste as a reduction in the quantity or quality of the edible portion of food intended for human consumption when food is redirected to non-food uses, or when there is a decrease in the nutritional value, food safety, or other quality aspect from the time food is ready for harvest or slaughter to consumption. So we further break this down into two important types of food loss and waste. So one is physical food loss and waste. So this is when the actual product, the quantity or volume, is redirected to a non-food use. And then we also highlight food quality loss. So this is the decrease in some sort of quality aspect, whether it's a nutrition value, food safety, or something else. And so the framework that we put together a pathways framework to illustrate what this actually looks like. And I'm going to walk through and build this out. So the first thing is setting our boundaries. So the boundary is effectively from when food is ready for harvest or slaughter all the way till food is eaten. So what goes into this pathway is our plants and animals that are produced for human consumption. These are meant to be eaten. They're not produced for animal feed. They're not produced intended for industrial use. It's produced with an intention for food, to be used as food. We anchor the framework in terms of 4 different points that are kind of these highlight points of what happened in a value chain. So rather than having the specific stages, we want to anchor, we use these anchors because they're applicable to all value chains, whether they're short or long. So once food is ready for harvest or slaughter, once harvest or slaughter is complete, and then food reaches consumers, and finally food is eaten. Ultimately, what we're really looking at is how these pathways lead to and contribute to diets, both in terms of the quantity, quality, diversity, and safety. And then when they don't contribute to diets, they're used for non-food, they go to non-food destinations. And so depending on what destination it goes to, it can have different environmental or economic impacts. Okay, so this top part is really the food loss and waste pathway. So because we're looking at food produced for human consumption, we really isolate the edible food or food parts. So in green is where edible food parts enter the value chain and eventually lead to contributing to diets when they're eaten. Along the way, physical food loss and waste happens. And so this is where the edible food part goes to a non-food destination. Food quality loss is happening all along the value chain. Depending on the type of quality loss, maybe it's really not that important for diets and you can still have a good quality diet that's safe. But sometimes it may, if food quality loss happens and that food is eaten, it might negatively impact diets. And so we can think of things like food safety loss. Food quality loss can also lead to physical food loss and waste, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And so that's when it enters this red pathway to a non-food destination. So then we add the inedible food parts because these are not technically, this is not counted as food loss and waste, but it's acknowledging that inedible parts are part of the system. And so we need to account for that when we think about the management of these non-food destinations. And so we know that inedible food parts enter the value chain and kind of follow along. And at different points, they're removed from the food value chain and go to these non-food destinations. And so what you'll see is that eventually all of these inedible parts go to non-food destinations because by definition, they're not intended to be eaten. So with food quality loss, or I guess with physical food loss and waste, this is a relatively simple piece because it's the removal, we can think of it in terms of the mass or volume of food that's removed from the system. But food quality loss is a bit more complicated because food quality itself is this complex construct. So there are infinite types of food quality attributes, but we want to think about which ones actually matter in these food loss and waste pathways. So the way that we kind of approach this is looking at attributes based on observation and using an SEC framework. So Search attributes are those that are easy to observe before you purchase or consume something. So you can think of color or shape or the size. Experience attributes are those that are observed at consumption. So we can think of things like taste or texture. And credence attributes are those that can't be immediately observed by direct experience. So these tend to be food safety issues or even nutrient content is a credence attribute. So we're not biting into an apple and saying, this is how much vitamin C is in the apple. You can't tell that based on your experience. We also look at attributes based on the food properties. And so intrinsic attributes are part of the physical product, so they can change over time. They may become more desirable, such as products that are ripening, but they also might be undesirable, such as over-ripening. And extrinsic attributes are those that are associated with the product, but they're not part of the product. And so they don't necessarily change over time. This could be something like if a food is produced organically, and so it's an organic product or it's not, that's not going to change as it moves across the value chain. So food quality loss is a reduction in one or several food quality attributes. So there is this element of change of a specific attribute. And again, there could be so many different attributes, quality attributes with a food product, but the impact of food loss and waste on is really based on a smaller number of these quality attributes and their acceptability thresholds. So we look at the attributes that limit food acceptance, which are context specific. They may be predefined or they might depend on specific conditions in a value chain. And they can shift from one set of attributes to another depending on where along the value chain they're evaluated. So we conceptualize this and say, okay, one or more, a combination of food attributes are used to decide the acceptance of food product. And that's how food quality loss is linked with food quality loss, and also just food quality, whether it changed or not, is linked with physical food loss and waste. So how does food quality loss and food quality attributes kind of change across different types of food systems? So from my work in my PhD, we sat with farmers who grow tomatoes, and we asked them about quality attributes, where they go, whether they're sold in the market or not. And so what we did is that we had freshly harvested tomatoes. We sat with farmers and gave them piles of tomatoes and just said, can you grade and sort these? And then we had a conversation about it. And what we found was that, so in this top heat map here, a higher or a darker red color means that that attribute was discussed more often across different piles, and it's by market grade category. And so what we find is that a lot of different attributes are kind of mentioned across different market grades, but really there are these hot spots around things like size or damage, also level of ripeness or storability are mentioned as well. And so some of these are related, right? Because you can imagine if a tomato is ripe or overripe, maybe the storability, that affects the storability. And so the way that we looked at this is saying, okay, there's many different quality attributes, but they have some sort of a function because these farmers don't have adequate storage. They have to bring their tomatoes to the wholesale market the next day. Transport is not necessarily improved. The roads conditions can be not great, and the transportation vehicles might also be challenging, that it creates vibration and the tomatoes are shaken and maybe they break. And so a lot of these quality attributes are actually pretty functional for the farmers because they can damage the tomatoes in such a way that renders them unsellable, promotes spoilage, etc. We also looked at, in terms of destination and use and marketability, these followed the, market grades that we would expect, where first quality tomatoes are generally sold as fresh food. And then as you decrease the market grade, it goes towards animal feed or trash. And same thing with marketability, whether they can always sell the product versus sometimes sell or never sell. As food systems transform and into modernized food systems, there's this change that happens with perishable foods where, particularly fruits and vegetables, where value is added by differentiating, like by product differentiation and having stricter quality standards. And this is where cosmetic quality attributes really comes into the conversation about food loss and waste. So suboptimal foods, which also are known as imperfect or ugly foods, these are foods with quality cosmetic attributes that deviate from what is average or common, or fall below some sort of a quality standard. The important part is that these are actually, nothing's really wrong with them in terms of the the eating quality, the nutrition content, the safety of it. They're perfectly edible and nutritious foods. It's just that there was some standard added that made them now kind of less desirable. And so when these diverting these suboptimal foods earlier in the value chain, that might be preferred by producers because they're no longer, when they leave these foods unharvested in the field because they can't sell them in the market because of these standards, they're not wasting resources. Maybe they can put them towards animal feed. And so now you have this preference to actually just leave these products unharvested. And so we view this, thinking about policies to address this, creating a diverse market channels are needed to expand the range of acceptable cosmetic attributes. This can reduce the physical food loss and waste piece. And so this includes both the channels for like the ugly foods, and I know those have come up a bit, but also thinking about, what retailers actually show consumers in terms of this range of what's an acceptable quality, because there is a question of, are consumers actually demanding the perfect peach? Are they demanding the perfectly shaped whatever vegetable or fruit? Or is it that they're just attuned now because these standards have been set, they're attuned to what is average or common, but that's not actually what's average or common in terms of natural production of these foods. And so addressing this can contribute to diet quality and reducing environmental impacts at these later stages of food transformation when we think about how value is added to products. In our book, we also take a closer look at environmental impacts. So there is a lot of concern of the food loss and waste associated climate change impacts, and these really depend on the extent of food loss and waste, the emission intensity, so this is the emissions per unit of food produced, and the food loss and waste management approach. So it's important to consider when looking at these impacts, how different food groups are associated. And so we can think about the difference between, for example, fruits and vegetables versus animal source foods. Both are nutritious and perishable, but they also have they may have different extents of food loss and waste, but also different emission intensity. And so thinking of those differences to understand the trade-offs is important. And also how, when food loss and waste is actually managed, if physical food loss and waste does happen, what non-food destinations are they going to? We also kind of step back from just looking at climate change and emissions intensity to say, the geographic scope of environmental impacts, it really does range from local to global. So we have to consider the trade-offs that are related to increased food production, the food loss and waste prevention approaches, and management of non-food destinations across different types of environmental impacts. So yes, emission intensity, the greenhouse gas emissions, but also thinking about changes in land use or water sources and those sorts of issues too that might happen at a more local level. And finally, we kind of look at the reverse. So we also want to understand, climate change that can make food loss and waste worse. There are higher temperatures, changes in rainfall, and increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. So where is this happening? What value chains is this affecting? And what's needed to basically mitigate the negative impacts that it's having on the food value chains? So an example that came up recently I guess we're still in October. So last month was this, and reported in the New York Times, where there was flooding and landslide that following extreme rainfall in Kashmir, India. So this blocked the way for apples. So we can see that all these apples were harvested, they were packed onto trucks, and then the trucks just couldn't get out of the region because the road was blocked. And so what we see is that there was a lot of food loss and waste of apples here. They had to be discarded on the side of the road. What's not pictured here, but what happened is that also these producers still have apples on the tree that they're not harvesting because they can't spend the resources to just put them on a truck to have them sit and rot on the road. And so thinking through what's needed in the current situation of how what climate change is bringing is important as well. The issue of food packaging definitely came up too. And so we know that, and this is a really big challenge with food loss and waste. So we know that packaging can reduce food loss and waste, but of course it has environmental and potentially health trade-offs. So policies are required to establish and enforce food grade packaging standards to protect health and the environment. So we're thinking about, what, and we differentiate between bulk packaging and retail and consumer packaging, but really for this consumer packaging, food that is being, because there's been a rise in the plastic packaging specifically, are these materials safe for being in contact with the food? What's the potential for health of how it interacts with the food, but also the health and environment on the production of the packaging and the disposal of the packaging. So regulations on end of life stage, the disposal and export of food packaging, we have to look at that to ensure that there's equity of food packaging trade-offs. So if you use food packaging in one region to reduce food loss and waste, but then that packaging is disposed of and maybe shipped out to somewhere else in the world, who's benefiting and who's losing out? And those are important things to consider. So in our last chapter, we look at, how do we move forward, and we set a food loss and waste policy agenda. So this really has kind of 4 aspects to that. The first is that we really need to focus on the demand piece for perishable food. And so the reason is we think a lot about the supply side and what happens to food along that channel for food loss and waste, but there needs to be this whole mechanism to create these incentives to actually reduce food loss and waste of these nutritious perishable foods so that we don't have these negative feedback loops that happen. And so part of this is adopting and strengthening food-based dietary guidelines. So again, really focusing on policies and pushing for policies that focus on nutritious foods that tend to be perishable, so that can inform other policies to follow suit. We want to improve food safety of fresh foods, and this really is important for building consumer trust. And again, creating that demand. Perishable foods are at risk of food safety issues with spoilage and contamination. And part of this also is establishing clear date labeling requirements. So again, communicating to the consumer so that they can have trust in the system. We also look at value addition innovations. So how can you create value by expanding cold chain infrastructure and development, supporting innovative processing of perishable foods. So we tend to think a lot about, fresh foods are highly perishable and there's a lot of food loss and waste that happens, but what's the role of processing and how can we have, how can that actually contribute to diet quality? And then finally, broadening the cosmetic standards to increase markets for ugly foods that we talked about. We also look at market coordination. So really investing in infrastructure to improve market access for high value perishable foods and encouraging market linkages and collaborative networks for smallholder producers and small and medium-sized enterprises. And this really focuses on not leaving these folks behind. And lastly is thinking about the environmental trade-offs. So of course, we need to manage food security environmental trade-offs, but we also look at opportunity where these things can align. Part of this is establishing guidelines for sustainable food packaging and also applying context-driven environmental scales to manage physical food loss and waste. So thinking about the context and what types of, when we say environmental impacts, what exactly are we talking about and who is negatively impacted by that? And so all of this requires right now collaboration between FAO and UNEP to set a comprehensive policy agenda at the international level. But then, the SDGs, the goal is really for 2030, and that's fast approaching. So we also think about, okay, who is it going to be FAO and UNEP beyond 2030 or other UN agencies to take on, continue this work on food loss and waste and setting a global policy agenda. So that's a little flavor of our book. I think now we'll move into a Q&A session, but QR code is here in case you haven't downloaded yet. Like Prabhu said, it's free. So we encourage you to take a look. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a great overview. And for everyone in the group, please either come off mute and ask your question out loud, or there's a Q&A box on the bottom menu bar you can ask in. And if you can't find that, feel free to just use the chat as well. In the meantime, I can start maybe. One of the things I found really, I guess, shocking, maybe not shocking, maybe that's not the right word, but at least reading the first chapter of the book, which kind of gives an overview of all of the other chapters that are to come, was how much you talked about the kind of trade-off in some of the interventions and how a lot of those interventions may actually have more negative impacts environmentally. They may improve loss and waste outcomes, but have other environmental damage. So maybe if you could speak a little bit more to that. I thought that was one of the interesting things that I hadn't necessarily considered quite so much. And you did speak a little bit about this already, but if you could add a couple points to that.
Sure. I think so. The way we look at the trade-offs in the book is in two ways. One is the management aspect, so management of food loss and waste. So when food loss and waste does happen, the destinations matter. And there are recommendations, like there's like a food loss and waste hierarchy by the US EPA and of which destinations are better, but really thinking about is that generalizable across different contexts? It may or may not be. Which types of environmental impacts are we talking about, and who stands to benefit and lose out? So we ask those questions. And then I think in terms of the actual preventing food loss and waste piece and potential environmental trade-offs there, are really about, we can use an example of cold chain. So cold chain is not just cold storage, it's not just cold transport. You need it consistent across the value chain to protect food. And because putting food in cold storage or in cold transport, it just slows down degradation. It's not, if you have a bad quality product going in, it's not going to look any better coming out. And so, what's required, of course, energy is required for, keeping cold chain, and where is that energy coming from? There have been efforts to look at using, solar energy, but what are those limitations? And we think about scalability. And so I think it's really about the trade-offs between, we know that we need to increase the supply, availability and access of these nutritious perishable foods. So you can either do that by production alone, which is probably not, that's a challenge, but then also reducing food loss and waste. So there's this, nutrition and diet issue that we need to get this food to people, but then thinking about what types of environmental impacts are there for reducing the food loss and waste, and are those trade-offs, how are they relative to like just increasing production, which is going to increase the amount of food that's in the value chain anyway. So we try to think through those I would say that the data is a challenge. And so I think we walk through it a bit more conceptually and we pull evidence where we can. But it is hard to come up with like a global number to say, this is the environmental impact because of the data issues, both in terms of food loss and waste itself, as well as data on environmental impact. Prabhu, I don't know if you wanted to add.
I just wanted to add that one of the reasons we brought up packaging and plastics is a real case of where the trade-offs are. Because as you try to modernize the food supply chain in developing countries, there's a big focus on getting better crates, better packaging material, etc. And most of this is plastics based. And that then may protect the food, but it also then creates other environmental problems. And so those are the types of trade-offs that one needs to think about. And also when you think about plastic bags at the consumer end and how that then leads to a lot of the trash that accumulates. So I think it's a much broader issue than just the food community when you think about food loss and waste. There's a whole bunch of questions that have come up. Do you want me to pick a few and read them out?
Yeah, please do.
There's a question from Pallavi from India, who's asked if we've considered the role of mechanization and automation in agriculture in your study, and also the impact of innovations that ag techs are offering in the waste domain.
So the answer is yes. I would say not on the production side, but in terms of, once food is ready for harvest. And so one of the things we found is that when you introduce automation and mechanization, how these technologies are built can also contribute to food loss and waste. So whether that's, a specific size of product that's needed to enter a machine, that can now all of a sudden you have a standard for a certain quality attribute, whether it's size or shape, that if it doesn't fit in the machine and you can't automate it, how does that work? On the flip side, there can be, relatively kind of simple solutions for grading and sorting where you have, it's a simpler technology where it's like a, different size holes, right? And so we kind of look at kind of the range of from more advanced to simpler technologies that can be used and how they impact the quality of products or quality standards that are needed and how that's related to food loss and waste. And then in terms of ag tech and food tech, there seems to be an issue of if something happened, issue of scalability and whether where things can work in one context versus another, and if they're scalable to reach kind of a broader sector of value chain actors in a specific for the use of that technology. And so again, I think this is where it's an issue too of availability of data. So we find that the public and private sector really need to work a bit better to share evidence. So there's a lot of, we can think of data missing in the middle of the value chain where there might be a lot of companies, whether that's organized companies or maybe informal, value chain actors. Who's collecting the data? Where does it exist? Is it publicly available or just available to somebody to draw conclusions? And so we need more of that to understand how we can scale some of these products.
Yeah, and one of the issues around mechanization and innovation is that the food companies themselves are now very actively involved in promoting better technologies. I recently visited a Walmart procurement facility for avocados in Mexico. And there they have small farms bringing avocado into this processing facility, which is completely mechanized, and all the grading, packing, everything is all mechanized and then transported out, exported out to the US market. So the food companies have been making major investments in this area. Of course, there's issues on access to those technologies for a wider variety of commodities and communities, which brings me to the next question from Astrid, which says essentially that you mentioned improvements needed on market coordination and focus on smallholders, but what about the need for wider supply chain collaboration and implications of power imbalance?
Yeah. So I'm glad you brought that up. We do talk about power imbalance and um, thinking about these food loss and waste pathways that occur along the value chain, but then each individual actor kind of has an incentive for their, where they work. And so we look at power imbalances across, how those change and how it affects food loss and waste um, in different types of situations. And so one example would be with like contracting and these grades and standards or quotas that a producer might need to meet. And so is entering a contract, what types of power imbalances does that kind of create, and how does that affect food loss and waste, whether it's a producer leaving product unharvested on the field um, because it doesn't meet either the quality criteria, or maybe it's too much product for that one contract, and they can't sell it anywhere else. So we walk through those. I think the other thing is incentives to reduce food loss and waste. So if, for example, a retailer says, yes, I'm going to reduce food loss and waste by rejecting product before I take ownership of it. And now that food loss and waste is actually happening for, the value chain actor before them, maybe it's the producer, but the retailer can say, oh, we reduced food loss and waste because it didn't enter our facility. And so really thinking about those types of, we talk through those types of power imbalances and how to address that, and how to think through it. We don't have answers for everything, of course, but I think this is really where highlighting who loses out in these situations is important.
Then Joe Yates wants to ask the question directly on the mic. So Joe, can you go ahead?
Just before Joe asks his question, I just want to mention we are at the top of the hour, so if anyone needs to go, thank you for joining. But I will keep the call open for anyone who is available to stay. I'm not sure how much time Jocelyn and Prabhu both have, but
There but three more questions that I can merge into one after Joe asks his question.
Great.
Okay, thanks so much. Thank you for a fascinating presentation. I really, really enjoyed it. And I'm going to be definitely sharing the recording around with a lot of people I think will really benefit from, the overview you gave. I was just, really nice to see you talk about packaging and plastics, which is what I work on a little bit. And I had a couple of just ponderings really. One in from my knowledge on some of the area that I work on is that we seem to be crying out for a study, good evidence that links plastic packaging with food waste, because there is some sort of illustrative evidence that it's plastic packaging can contribute to people purchasing more than they need, buy one fruit, get bog off offers and all this kind of stuff, and then it also contributes to people, this moral hazard of people leaving it in their fridge and stuff and it going off because they just the packaging will keep it, and then you look in your fridge and my god, all these cucumbers have gone off even though they're in. So I think that would be really interesting. I don't know if you know of anyone working on that, but it'd be great as a balance, because obviously plastic packaging plays an important role in preservation. I don't know if you've heard of anything like that, but also on the other side of things, thinking about when you mentioned the trade-offs of, obviously, if someone uses packaging in one context and it provides a benefit, and while in another context it can be detrimental. I was thinking about the type of plastic packaging you see livestock, for instance, eating on the side of the road, and in many places around the world, this is prevalent, isn't it? And I'm thinking about your back to your diagram when you say you classify where exactly the food loss happens. And I think you've got the slaughter. Is it from the slaughterhouse onwards, or is it because I'm thinking, issues related to livestock ingestion and animals getting sick, and a whole bunch of different pathways, including mortality. Anyway, yeah, I guess the question is a philosophical one about how far do you go to, is it feasible to go to measure those impacts and then to sort of balance that trade-off calculation? Thanks.
Sure. So I'll answer the last question first and then go back to your first question. So because of time, we didn't have, so we spend, I think it's chapter 5, where we talk about this idea of like, what's that, when the food is ready for harvest or slaughter and when that actually happens, like what are those moments? Because they are pretty ambiguous. And they depend, and that's because it depends on the context, it depends on the markets. So for like livestock, so where the slaughter happens depends on, again, the context, and it may be at like animals are brought to a central slaughterhouse, maybe it's done more locally, wherever it is. And so we do consider when the animal is alive and they're being transported, what kind of conditions can actually impact the quality of meat after it's slaughtered. So we do look at that in chapter 5. I don't think we mentioned like eating plastic, but that is, could be part of that, in terms of we consider the health of the animal, and we do pull evidence of that does exist about certain conditions that do affect their health, and then the quality of the meat, or if it leads to mortality. So we think about that, and there's more detail there both for animal source foods and for fruits and vegetables. For the plastic packaging, so sorry, it was
It's about the trade-off, whether there's any studies that looked at the trade-off and how do you measure that and all that, right, Jeff?
right. So
Yeah, it was just a question. Have you seen any research that looks at the role of whether plastic packaging has a role in food waste, in creating,
right.
in
Yeah,
driving food waste?
that's right. Yeah, so we address it in a few different areas. One is packaging in general, whether or not it's plastic, but how it's designed. So does it have a lot of labels on it? Can you actually see the product? Because sometimes what happens is when food is pre-packaged and then you open it and then you're like, well, I wouldn't have purchased this if I knew it was going to look like that. So we do consider, how the packaging is kind of constructed and what type, like how consumers can then actually view the product that they're buying or wanting to buy. And how that's related to food loss and waste. And then the other side, and yeah, you're right that there is evidence that people tend to, buy more. And then we also think about, are there, it's not just kind of a blanket food packaging for all food, and that's a good thing to prevent food loss and waste. But when we think about the trade-offs, packaging for like meat is probably good to reduce contamination of certain things. Or, packaging does serve a purpose for protecting food and efficiency of moving it along the value chain. And so that's where we think about like the role of bulk packaging versus the role of individual packaging, and what kind of helps move food along, and how it can either contribute to food loss and waste. Also, we think about the food quality loss piece as well. And so, people talk about consumer waste of like, oh, it's a consumer who's buying too much, they're doing all these things and they're not keeping track of, they need to use a shopping list. But all of these things are happening from the moment it's harvested until it gets to the consumer that can reduce the quality of the product. And so when they buy the food and bring it into their household, maybe it doesn't last as long as they thought it would. Again, maybe they open that package and it's not what they expected. So we think through those pieces as well.
Yeah, and consumer behavior is such an important part of what needs to happen in addressing food loss and waste. We were giving a talk about food loss and waste, and somebody asked me, what do you personally do to reduce waste? And I said, well, in my home, we only buy 2 days worth of fresh food. And so buying a small quantity of fresh food actually helps us reduce loss. But we are fortunate, we are close to a supermarket. But those people who are long distance away will find that not a particularly useful solution. But there's a lot that one can do from consumer behavior point of view. There's a few other questions, Jocelyn. Katamani wants to know what's the one thing that we should be doing and who should be the main responsible person for addressing that. I hope I got that question right.
Sure. I think it really comes back to how we started out the book and thinking about, at the global level, I would say, right now it's FAO and UNEP, like we need to focus in on say, like, what is it that we're talking, like we need to come to an agreement. They need to lead that to say, this is what food loss and waste is, this is what it covers. And it doesn't mean that if you're going to go out and collect data or find a solution that it needs to address all aspects of food loss and waste across all these pathways, but it's really acknowledging, this is where maybe one entity is going to do some of the work and where it fits into the larger perspective. So I think that's the starting point. And like I said, we have such little data that we need more. And now is the opportunity to say, okay, let's agree on a definition that can pave the way for having, better collaboration on collecting better data, and moving forward on the issue. Because otherwise we're just talking about a lot of different things.
Yeah. There's a couple more questions. Irene wants to know whether we've considered cultural values and practices related to food in view of food loss and waste at the local level.
Yes. So in well, I shouldn't say this because I might be wrong, but I believe it's chapter 3. We have a in-depth discussion about, what is edibility? What's an edible food? What's an inedible food part? Because it has two components to it. One is a food safety issue. So like, is it safe to eat that inedible or that part? Is it edible or inedible? But then the second part is it culturally, the norm? And so in some cultures, eating, one part of an animal or, one part of a fruit or vegetable is the cultural norm. And so that is an edible food part. And then in some, it's not. And so when we define edibility, we really need to account for these cultural considerations.
Okay. And Nola had a couple of questions, so maybe I'll just ask her to ask directly.
They actually were just questions I was copying over from the chat. So
Okay.
I don't know if Ripa or Afiabora are still on the call. It looks like Ripa, actually both of you seem to still be here. If you want to ask your question, otherwise I can read them out from the chat. Well, Ripa had asked, in developed countries, are there already penalties for food waste or industrial waste? In Indonesia, waste management, especially the separation between dry and wet waste, is still inadequate. Moreover, society tends to be materialistic, so without financial incentives, even the best waste reduction programs often fail to sustain, particularly in handling household waste. Additionally, Indonesia still imports waste. Thank you.
So there are a few, I can't remember them off the top of my head, but it is in the book, countries that have some policies, but they're not broad, comprehensive food loss and waste policies. I know in the US, certain states or cities have, on the waste management side where you have to separate out food waste from regular, like other household waste. I live in New York City, and that food waste gets incinerated, and for energy capture, and then I believe it ends up being made as some compost as well, or some sort of amendment, soil amendment. So, which is different from when I lived in California, where they also collected food waste and exclusively turned that into compost, and then we were eligible to like pick up compost once a year to use. And so there are different approaches, but I would say nothing is comprehensive both from like a country level and kind of system level piece that I've seen.
I think we've covered most of the questions. And thank you to everybody who said this was great work and all
Yeah,
that.
thanks so much.
Well, I'll
Back
say
to you.
that is the truth. This was really fantastic. And we're really glad to have you, Jocelyn, and Prabhu here to kick off this research community. It's been really great for me to see so many people participating and sharing in the chat. I'm not sure if you guys had a chance to see all the different countries that were covered on this call, but we had, I think 3 continents and many countries, which is fantastic. If you want to join more calls like this as part of this research community, you can sign up on the A&H Academy website, and you can see the link in the chat. I'll post it in a minute. And you can also email us, which is just me, Nola, Will, and Shaylin on this call, to help you share at a future event in this community about food supplies and waste, or in our other parallel community about food access and demand for healthy diets. So I just want to thank you all again for being here. I thought this was fantastic. And a big thank you to Prabhu and Jocelyn. I thought it was a really, really great way to kick things off and give a big overview of what's to come in this community. So thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.